And viewers, this is why World War I is much more exciting and much more important than World War II.
This is not a world that Hitler would recognise or even survive in. There's no need for Hitler in this scenario. There's no need, perhaps, for communism or fascism.
What we're talking about now is not one Second World War, but instead a world which has lots of regional wars by great powers. We're not talking teddy bears and biscuits, are we? This is still a dark and violent world full of imperial and international conflict.
It's a global conflict rather than a world war, that's the point.
Ultimately, fundamentally, it's the Germans screwing up and provoking the US on a simply epic scale of incompetence. That's fundamentally the answer.
I mean, that is a really big counterfactual. So you would end up with a 20th century, potentially, with Germany dominating Eastern Europe.
Yeah, they've got what we later knew as Lebensraum.
It's the 6th of April 1917, and the United States has just made a decision which will change history forever. A declaration of war against Germany, which brought the US into the First World War. Until this point, President Woodrow Wilson had maintained an isolationist approach and resisted any appeals from the Allies to come on side. Yet public opinion had shifted over time, and after the intercepted Zimmermann telegram proposed a possible alliance between Germany and Mexico, this was followed by the resumption of unrestricted German submarine warfare, and the US was left with little choice but to act. Millions of troops, resources and economic support followed, which no doubt had a huge impact on the Allies' push for victory, meaning the US decision to enter the war will forever have its place in the what-ifs of history. I'm James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or tide of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. This episode is sponsored by Visit Malta. Right at the heart of the Mediterranean, Malta is a blend of history, culture, nature and hospitality. To find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. Today, we're looking at the US's decision to enter the First World War, a seismic moment which had huge ramifications for the end of the conflict. Yet what if they'd decided to stay out of it? Does the war end in a peace treaty? Does Germany control much of Eastern Europe? And do you get the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s? These are questions for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And returning once again is our resident First World War expert, Professor Alexander Watson from Goldsmiths University. Welcome to you both. Well, let's get into this. First of all, Alex, welcome back to History Undone. I wonder if you can tell us what is the major motivation for the US to enter the war in 1917, because they've been pursuing this policy of neutrality up until now, pursuing this idea of isolationism. What is it that draws America into the war in the end?
So, ultimately, fundamentally, it's the Germans screwing up and provoking the US on a simply epic scale of incompetence. That's fundamentally the answer. But it's worth kind of just going back a little and just thinking how unlikely it is that the US is going to involve itself in this war, which has been going on already for 3 years, has already caused millions of deaths, has seen Europe rip itself apart. You've got strong public isolationism in the US and a strong tradition of public isolationism. You have other priorities. Why focus on Europe at the Atlantic when you've got Japan rising in the Pacific? In 1916, there are American troops operating in Mexico. No reason why they may not have been bogged down in 1916, stopping the US entering the war in 1917. And then, of course, you've got President Wilson himself, who had grown up during the US Civil War, come from the South, seen lands devastated. He wasn't a warmonger in any way, shape or form. So when we're asking how likely is it that the US enters the war, actually, it's very, very unlikely indeed.
And Chris, what is fascinating is that at the start of 1917, the Allies are in an incredibly weak position in different ways. Britain is struggling economically. You've got mutinies in France, of course, in Russia. You're about to have the Russian Revolution. So, this is a weak point for the Allies.
Yes, but I think we also need to look at it from the other side as well. There's a discussion in January 1917 between the Kaiser and his military advisors, and they're saying, look, we're facing 190 divisions in the West at the moment. We've only got 150. We're still fighting on two big fronts here. What are we going to do about it? And the answer, as Alex says, is come up with this idea of unrestricted warfare. The other issue is Germany and the Central Powers here are being heavily blockaded by the Royal Navy. And this is starting to tell. They're getting short of raw materials, getting short of food. They can't actually break out into the Atlantic to do anything about this. We've had the Battle of Jutland the previous year, and the High Seas Fleet decides it wants to stay in port just for now. And they don't have enough U-boats either to interdict British trade. Now, you've got 28 million tonnes of British shipping at this stage, and they're trying to get through it. But at the moment, they're probably averaging about anything between 800,000 and 1 million a year tonnes in terms of shipping losses for the Allies. That's really not really good enough because obviously the Allies are building, both France and Britain are building merchant ships. So they really need to up their game. And the real problem they've got is they're having to identify ships before they actually destroy them. And that means surfacing in some cases, or indeed actually finding out what nationality the ship is. That makes them vulnerable to anti-submarine measures, which are coming on. They're pretty primitive, but they are coming on. Now, if you have unrestricted submarine warfare, you just shoot on sight anything within what you consider to be the war zone, and obviously isn't German or one of your allies. And so they basically come up, as Alex says, with this idea of returning actually to unrestricted submarine warfare, something they tried earlier. And guess what? The Americans complained about it. Now, there's something on the American side here, and that is since President Theodore Roosevelt's real ambitions for the United States Navy, the Americans have adopted an oceanic policy. And it's to do with trade, their ability to expand their investments, and also to project military power across two oceans, and that's the Atlantic and the Pacific. And this is encapsulated in a geopolitical thinker called Alfred Thayer Mahan. And he basically says, look, if you control the sea, you control the trade of the world, then you dominate everything. And that suits a continental power like the United States, with its Monroe Doctrine, of course, throughout the Americas. And we shouldn't underestimate the maritime ambitions of the United States at this point in time. And we shouldn't forget also that they see that one of their greatest rivals, of course, is the Royal Navy.
Yes.
At this stage, we assume that everybody's on the same side, but we actually have American plans to deal with the Royal Navy in the context of this oceanic fleet.
And Alex, we should probably just mention, I mentioned it in the introduction, the Zimmerman telegram and why that is so significant in drawing the US into the war.
So this was a telegram issued by the Foreign Secretary of the German government, Max Zimmermann, offering an alliance to Mexico if the US entered the war. It never actually reached Mexico. It was sent down US diplomatic telegraph lines, diplomatic routes, because the Germans hadn't got any of their own because the Royal Navy had cut them in 1914. And it was intercepted by British naval intelligence. And the British instantly realised just how explosive this was, but they couldn't tell the Americans directly because it would reveal to the Americans that the British were reading their diplomatic correspondence. So they did some deals in Mexico and got a second copy of the telegram and then showed it to the US and said, look what the Germans are planning to do. And amazingly, at this point, the Germans don't stay quiet. The US sees it, they publish it on the 1st of March, 1917. So this is a month after after Germany has reintroduced this unrestricted submarine warfare that Chris was talking about. Published on 1st of March, causes a huge stir and outrage in US public opinion. And the Germans, rather than remaining silent, very honestly say, yeah, it was us.
But more importantly, they actually say, look, if this is successful, this alliance, we'll give you Texas and New Mexico.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So all the congressmen there all go, hang on. So there's all sorts of problems associated. What's really interesting about this is the coding associated with the telegram was actually captured in Afghanistan, where the Germans had abandoned this code book, and it was actually used to decrypt the Zimmerman telegram.
Well, listen, let's look at the map we have in front of us now. This is a map of the North Atlantic as it would have been in 1917. And you mentioned, Chris, how crucial the naval situation is, particularly when it comes to winning the First World War in the end. Do you want to talk us through? So the US have entered the war in April 1917. What happens next?
There's a couple of things that happen next. You get an immediate uplift in the amount of naval support that comes across. Admiral Sims, who basically is heading the approach of the US Navy to what's happening in Europe, comes across. He can't believe how shambolic the anti-submarine campaign is. And he immediately says, we've got to get some destroyers across here to help the Brits. And they base them in Queenstown and other ports in the west of Ireland. And in the end, nearly 250 destroyers, sloops and corvettes come across from the United States. So it's a significant uplift. But the other issue about April 1917 is it's the greatest number of sinkings by U-boats. You're talking about, in that month alone, you're talking about 550,000 tons of British shipping go down, among which actually was my great-grandfather's brother, who was sunk in a ship called the Jose de Larranaga in April 17. And that's quite significant. The total Allied losses in that month are 690,000 tons. Now, when you bear in mind the average merchantman is about 5,000 to 7,000 tons, that's quite a lot of shipping. And at this stage, the Royal Navy is resisting the convoy system, which, of course, everybody is saying, look, if you've got one ship, its footprint in the ocean is almost the same to a submarine as a 20 ships, so why not protect them? And there's huge resistance in the naval staff because Admiral Jellicoe, the first Sea Lord, says, I don't believe in convoys. And I've discussed with Alex about this. I think Jellicoe at this point is approaching a nervous breakdown. And what breaks the issue here is somebody smuggles in a naval commander to see David Lloyd George, who's just taken over as Prime Minister from Asquith, and he briefs him on this. And David Lloyd George immediately says, we are going to introduce the convoy system. And so you've got not only the convoy system coming in with the latest sort of anti-submarine measures that we've got, very primitive by World War II or even modern standards, but you've got escorting vessels, you've got this huge influx of American vessels as well, and many of the admirals in World War II, the Kings, the Halseys, cut their teeth in destroyers in World War I in the west of Ireland. So immediately the American intervention helps this, pushes the convoy system, makes it work, and gives you quite a lot of fighting power. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy is maintaining the blockade on Germany. They're squeezing them very hard in terms of the raw materials that they're getting, the food that's coming in. And it's not just Germany, it's their allies as well that are suffering. And again, this puts additional pressure on the Germans to actually take that. Now, I think the other interesting and important point is the Germans know the Americans are coming. They can see what the potential is. And so, of course, they think, unless we do something on the Western Front, then it's all going to go very bad for us, because they're looking down a tunnel that's got 2 million men on the end of it. They're not mobilized yet, they're not equipped yet, but they are coming. And so I always believe that a lot of wars are settled by windows of vulnerability and windows of opportunity. And obviously Germany sees it's vulnerable. It thinks, I've got to look for a window of opportunity. What can we do to break this?
And that's important, actually, in thinking about why Germany launches this renewed unrestricted submarine warfare campaign. We're thinking about it just from the German perspective as well. Admirals can be brilliant. The Royal Navy, of course, Chris emphasises, won the war for Britain to a great extent. German admirals, less successful. And the German Admiralty in particular had been pushing and pushing and pushing for the renewal of unrestricted submarine warfare. It said, this is what's going to get us out of this desperate situation. This is what's going to win the war for us. And the civilian government had actually been resisting against that. The Chancellor is a guy called Bethmann Hollweg. He had pushed back, said, no, it will bring America into the war. The idea that the US should enter the war if if Germany started sinking neutral ships was not something that the Germans didn't think about. They knew it was going to happen, and the civilian government had tried to stop it. But the Navy got the support of the Army, and the Navy said, look, this is what we're doing. We aren't going to be able to hold out for much longer. Even more so, our ally, Austria-Hungary is in terrible danger of collapse. We've got to win this war. These conversations going on at the end of 1916. We've got to win this war within 6 months, basically within 6 to 8 months. And so the plan for this, and viewers, this is why World War I is much more exciting and much more important than World War II, okay? This is the key one, as well as shaping the whole 20th century. The argument is if we can sink 600,000 tonnes of British and neutral merchant shipping a month, scare off other neutral shipping from the seas, then we can starve Britain out. But we have to do it now. We have to start at earliest 1st of February, because the new harvest will be in August. So we've got this window of 5-6 months to starve the British out. And if Britain goes, France and Russia will fall.
So there is a logic there, because even though it's very easy for us now, in 2025, to look back and go, well, the Germans were deluded. What were they doing launching unrestricted submarine warfare at the beginning of 1917? It lost them the war. There is at least some logic behind it.
There's a lot of thinking behind it, but there are also a lot of problems behind it. Chris has pointed out they haven't actually got enough submarines to do this. Pre-war study argues that to starve Britain out, you'd need 220 submarines. They've got about 120. They don't actually know how much shipping the British have available or how much food Britain needs to import in order to keep itself going. And they overestimate as well just the sheer amount of strain on the submarine crews as well. Bear in mind, 50% of submarine crews, 1 in 2, die during this war.
I mean, the important thing to remember about World War I, these are not true submarines, they're submersibles.
Yeah.
And so they operate on the surface quite a lot. It makes them much more vulnerable. But I think the issue, we have to turn it around the other way again, of course, and say what people were thinking at the time in London. At the time, Jackie Fisher, says, you know, we've got to make sure the Navy doesn't lose this war before the Army can win it. And Beatty, who takes over as First Sea Lord from Jellicoe, says, well, you know, is it going to be their blockade or ours that is decisive? So even the British are thinking this could be critical. But as Alex says, they underestimated the scale of the task. They didn't do their operational analysis. This is something the Germans are not good at sea in both world wars. They don't do their operational analysis. But we mustn't forget, there's also a threat down here in the Mediterranean as well. The French are trying to tie down. And one of the little-known things is that in Malta, you had 3 Japanese cruisers and 14 destroyers deployed on anti-submarine and anti-surface work during the First World War. And that shows you the ambition and the reach of the Japanese, even at this stage, that they're actually operating from Malta in the Mediterranean.
It's a real pivotal moment, isn't it, for the war and actually for the whole of the 20th century when we think about US and Japanese involvement.
Yeah, it really is the
hinge,
hinge of the 20th century, yeah, in some ways, yeah.
OK, well, listen, let's zoom in now and focus on the ground campaign that ensues once the US enter the war. OK, we're going to discuss the ground campaign in just a moment, but before we do that, let's run through some of the key statistics. The US committed over 4.7 million personnel to the war, with around 4 million in the US Army. Over 2 million were deployed to France as part of the American Expeditionary Forces. They suffered over 116,000 casualties, with 53,402 dying in combat and a further 63,114 of non-combat causes, mostly Spanish flu. An additional 204,000 American troops were wounded, and the cost of joining the war was enormous, around $32 billion, or 52% of gross domestic product at the time. So how does this change things from here on in? Well, let's talk about the ground campaign. We've got a new map in front of us showing the German ground offensive in the spring of 1918. Alex, first of all, I think it's probably worth reflecting on the American forces, because you know what they have by the end of the war in 1918 is very different to what they have available when they join in April of 1917.
Yeah, so this is it. So when we talk about 2 million US troops in France and Belgium, that's absolutely true, but we're talking November 1918, at the very, very end of the war. If we roll back to April 1917, when the US intervene in the war, the US Army is tiny. It's fewer than 200,000 men. And this is one reason why the German military is really not that bothered whether the Americans get upset about unrestricted submarine warfare or not. What are they going to do? They've got a tiny little army. They haven't got any conscription. at this time, though they introduce it. And they've got to get this tiny little army right across the Atlantic Ocean as well. By the time that they manage that, so the German High Command thinks, the war is going to be over anyway. And the German High Command, the military, are planning a last decisive offensive in the spring of 1918. The Eastern Front against Russia has collapsed. The Germans are victorious there, and they're able to bring over 1 million troops over to France and Belgium. And for the first time since 1914, they've got a preponderance, they've got a superiority in manpower against the British and the French. In March 1918, as well as big British army, big French army, there's only about 300,000 US troops there. They're inexperienced, they're in training, and actually they're not very well equipped either. The US had to rely on British and French equipment, artillery and tanks and all sorts of other things that a modern army needs in order to prepare itself to fight. So from the German perspective, they really weren't a factor.
So, Chris, why doesn't the spring offensive from the Germans in 1918 work?
First of all, intelligence. They don't have a real grip on where the various formations are along the front here. They've underestimated the extent to which the British and the French have been able to supply their frontline troops. Their own supply situation isn't great. And they're not really equipped for getting to Paris, which is probably what they were seeking to achieve, is to knock the French out as they did in the Franco-Prussian War. They also attack on two broader fronts. And they find themselves up against formations that are hardened now. They've been fighting for quite some time. And interestingly enough, the preponderance of air power actually works in the Allies' favour on this occasion. So both in terms of reconnaissance and artillery spotting, but also in terms of actually bombing along the front line, you find that actually the Allies are much more powerful. The other issue is that as usual, the Germans telegraph their assault very much ahead of time, and that is picked up. You've got these concentrations opposite. The British and French are able to adjust, and of course they're able to bring into parts of the line that aren't so threatened, these American troops that are dribbling in at the start.
It's worth emphasising, though, that when these German troops go over on the 21st of March 1918, there's a huge concentration of them. There's an enormous bombardment, 6 million shells fired in 5 hours into British lines. This is where it's happening, over here. And for 3 years, there's been stasis. The front has hardly moved, at least not through any force of arms. There's been a German retreat in early 1917, a year before. But this March offensive appears to open the front up. Suddenly you get very, very significant movement. The British Army does reel back. There's huge numbers of prisoners captured. And it is a real moment of crisis, especially for the British at the end of March, as to whether the Germans are going to break through or not. Now, Chris has already pointed out that one big problem that the Germans have in the way they think about war is they're not very good at operational planning. They're good at the tactics, and there's all sorts of new, very modern tactics on display here. Infiltration tactics, working around strong points, lightly equipped stormtroopers who are able to advance and overwhelm Allied command and control. But they're not thinking about what the actual objectives are. They're not focusing on the key transport hubs for the British, which are at Amiens and at Hazebrouck. And if they'd focused on these two and got to them, this is where these transport hubs, because this is where railway lines all come together. And armies in 1918 are still very, very heavily dependent on railways to keep themselves reinforced, keep themselves supplied. If the Germans had captured either Amiens or Hazebrouck, then that would have forced a really large retreat because the British armies couldn't have kept themselves supplied. But they don't recognise that logistical dimension of war. And as a result, all this strength that they've got is dissipated in creating what, if you like, is a bag.
Yep.
So do you think the spring offensive could have worked for the Germans?
Definitely. I mean, what Alex is talking about is what we say today as a centre of gravity. You always go for your enemy's centre of gravity. And if there's one British neurosis in the First World War, it is the link to the coast here and the supply and the retreat line, of course, if you have to go back that way. The French are talking about it all the time. Can we trust the Brits up in this sector? Because actually it's an easy trip back to the Channel again. And so it's absolutely right. I would go further, Alex. I would say the strategic direction of this campaign also doesn't establish what political and military objectives are required here. And as I said, it's just totally on a broad front here. And if you look at some of the orders given to the divisional commanders in the German army, there's no sense of this is what we're trying to achieve overall. It's what you're going to achieve in your sector opposite you. And that sort of doctrine nowadays would be sort of put out of town.
Yeah, and you end up, instead of, as Chris has said, a concentrated offensive, you end up with a series of offensives of ever-diminishing power. So you first have the British Army attacked by the Germans here in March, and then in April there's a new attack up in the north of the line, and then in May the French army is attacked here. But ultimately, the Germans are wearing themselves out while they're doing this. And of course, the Allies are losing huge quantities of soldiers as well as killed and especially as prisoners. But this is where the Americans come in, and this is the key American contribution. The Allies are able to replace their losses through American reinforcements. The Germans, they can't.
And I mean, what's quite interesting about this is that the Americans are absolutely adamant they are not in there just to supplement British and French troops. They're going to operate on their own. And they're not going to go into the front line until they're fully trained and ready to go. And this causes a lot of irritation amongst the British and French commanders. But the Americans have seen how the British and French have fought, and they're saying we're not going to send our boys into that sort of machine again. So they're very careful under General Pershing that they're trained, they're ready to go, and they know exactly what they're required to do. On their own merits.
So do you think, Alex, that the German spring offensive would have succeeded had it not been for the presence of the US?
I don't know that it would have succeeded in its objective of splitting the British and the French armies and pushing the British up to the coast. I think the Germans had the strength to do it. But I think it could have brought about a more favourable strategic position for the Germans, leading in a negotiated peace in which the British and the French agree to accept German domination of Central and Eastern Europe, and actually German domination of the continent ultimately.
I mean, it's interesting that if you read Heinz Guderian's memoirs, he says, this is the lesson I take when I sort out my tactics, which we call today blitzkrieg. You know, this must never happen again, this spring offensive, the way this has happened. And it's quite important. And as we said, if you concentrated your resources here and really, I think, probably saturated one of these sectors, you might have broken through, either in the north, as Alex says. I think the French are a bit powerful by this stage, to tell you the truth. But you know, behind that, you've got there are two things happening. One is the Germans are seeing that the British and French are really well supplied with ammunition and food and everything else. And there's also the looming prospect of 2 million American troops coming in. So even if we break through here, you know, what's going to happen next?
And that's, again, why the First World War is so dramatic, because we're dealing with a clock, which is ticking down for the Germans. Can they beat the British and French before the Americans come over in force? There's only 300,000 US troops in March 1918. There's 2 million by November.
And they know that.
And they know that, exactly. They know that's coming. So they're really against the clock on this. And the idea of what is the big US contribution? The big US contribution in order to stop the British and the French being defeated isn't in terms of blood, it isn't in terms of amazing fighting power, it's not in terms of technology, it's simply in terms of their potential.
Post-dated check.
Yeah, post-dated check. They're there and they're coming. And that is enough.
So, Chris, how do we get from this situation in the spring of 1918 to armistice by November? Because you've had 4 years of almost stagnation on the Western Front, and suddenly things move very quickly. So do you want to talk us through what happens after the failure of the spring offensive?
Absolutely. Well, obviously there's consolidation. You've got more American troops coming in. You've got massive disparities in manpower here. But more importantly, behind here, you've got the Central Powers collapsing as societies. The blockade is having a real effect on not just Germany, but Austria-Hungary as well. And the Italians are advancing, of course, against the Austrians in the Alps, in the south. And everything is just getting a bit desperate. And then, of course, you have the final offensives in 1918 by the British and the French. And the Germans are able to fall back to pre-prepared lines, but it doesn't hold because they just don't have the ammunition, the industry, or the supplies to be able to continue it. And of course, you're starting to get, it does start here, in fact, you get German troops saying, look, we're actually going to lose this. First time ever you get German troops sort of really saying to their commanders, we just don't see how we're going to win this. You see in the letters home, this is not a great situation now. What's the best we can do out of this? But in fact, the initiative passes very much to the Allies at this point, and the Germans, of course, aren't able to hold the line and sustain it for long.
Yeah, the tipping point comes in July with a French-led counterattack with British and also crucially with American troops as well. And this is the point at which the Germans finally have blown their chances and the Allies start advancing toward Germany. I'm going to say something nice about the British Army here because I'm not sure, because I'm slightly worried that Chris might not.
I love my army colleagues.
Fine, all right then, all right. Well, but the British and the French have learned a lot from how you fight a war on the Western Front. They've learned how to combine artillery and infantry. The troops are much more skilled than, say, they were in 1916. We discussed the Somme in a previous episode. And they've got huge amounts of transport behind them as well. When we think about the end of the war, it's not just artillery and tanks, it's above all trucks that keep the Allied troops moving, allow them to move beyond their railheads and keep them advancing eastward toward Germany. And that's really important too. It really shows German troops, as Chris is saying, that the war is over. And the US play a key part in this as well. They fight at Saint-Mihiel here in September. There's the Meuse-Argonne offensive as well, end of September, October. They're not as skilled as British and French troops. Parts of the offensive, they mess up. They use much bigger formations, which are very unwieldy. But nonetheless, the Americans too show what they can do. And from October 1918 onwards, the German army is in a process of ever greater disillusion, demoralisation, and even desertion. And already before that, from the summer, from July, vast numbers of prisoners are coming over to the Allies as well.
And of course, the First World War ends in November 1918. That is the real history of what happened after the US entered the war. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, well, let's do what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves, had the US not entered the First World War, what the rest of history may have looked like? We've got a new map in front of us. And Alex, you want to talk us through the significance of this map? Because we've spoken a lot about the importance of the Western Front. But what's happening in Eastern Europe is really crucial, particularly when we talk about some of the counterfactuals.
Yeah, OK, and it ties in as well with that disastrous German decision to launch unrestricted submarine warfare and bring in the US. Because actually, at the start of 1917, Germany is on the verge, without realising it, of a victory of global proportions. The British are running out of money. The US are constricting their loans. The French army is mutinying, serious indiscipline on the Western Front. And Russia is on the eve of revolution. None of this appears to be known to the Germans, and the Germans are so desperate that's why they launched this huge gamble. But if they hadn't done that, and if the US had stayed out of the war, then the Russian Revolution in March 1917 would still have taken place. The Germans would therefore have gained control of Eastern Europe, and this map shows Eastern Europe. It shows the front where the fighting ended in 1917, as well as the land that the Germans took in early 1918. It shows Poland, it shows what is today Ukraine. And if the US hadn't entered the war, if the Germans hadn't sent that Zimmermann telegram, if they hadn't launched unrestricted submarine warfare, if they hadn't provoked the US into the war, then what this map clearly shows is that the Germans would have ended up in control of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and ultimately all of Europe.
I mean, that is a really big counterfactual. So you would end up with a 20th century potentially with Germany dominating Eastern Europe.
Yeah, they've got what we later knew as Lebensraum.
Yeah.
And so you haven't got that connection. But there is another counterfactual here, and that is that the Americans and the British saw that there was going to be a problem once the Tsar had abdicated. And they actually said to the provisional government, look, we're going to give you $325 million in loans to keep you in the war. And by staying in the war, it gave the Germans the advantage to actually press on the Russians a bit harder, because Russian front is collapsing, authority in Russia is dissipating, and the fact that they stay on a bit longer in the war gives the Bolsheviks their chance to actually overthrow the provisional government and then accelerate the revolution. So you do have a scenario whereby if the Americans hadn't intervened with the offer of loans, then the provisional government after the Tsar might have survived, the Bolsheviks wouldn't have come to power, and of course the whole history of Russia and Eastern Europe becomes different after that.
And even under your scenario, Alex, where the Bolsheviks have come to power, presumably that entire regime is far weaker because of German domination of much of Eastern Europe.
Yeah, so in that scenario, what we're looking at is something akin to the Warsaw Pact of the post-war period, where the Soviet Union had satellite states, Poland and others, kind of acting as a barrier. So what we would have had after 1918, if the Germans had been triumphant, is a satellite state of Poland, most likely a satellite state of Ukraine as well. And that's
Finland as well.
Finland as well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's really crucial. I want to focus a bit more on Ukraine, because for the 20th century Soviet Union, and indeed for Imperial Russia as well in the 19th century, Ukraine was where the power lay. Russia can't be a great power without Ukraine. And the Russians and the Soviets knew that. This is where the key agricultural resources are. This is, above all, is where the industry is of the old Russian Empire. So taking this means a far, far, far weaker Russia/Soviet Union. No big superpower standoff in the 20th century, at least not between the Soviet Union and the US.
I mean, just put it in numbers. If this came to pass, the Russian Empire would lose 38% of its population, 57% of its industrial output, 89% of its coal production. And that really takes the heart out of any economy. And we've got to remember that the Russian economy actually was building quite strongly before the First World War. And who knows where that would have gone. But this would have been a significant bite, as Alex says, out of the Russian Empire. And of course, it underlines, of course, why Ukraine's important today to Russia and, of course, to the Ukrainians. But we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which, if you put a customs union, a Zollverein in here, all the impetus for what happens after the First World War goes away. So the Adolf Hitler's philosophy of Lebensraum, this whole idea that you actually need this industrial power at the heart of Europe, this is associated with sort of Mackinder's geopolitical theories, means that quite a lot of it goes down a different track entirely, whether it's a Bolshevik Russian Soviet Union or indeed a continuing Russian empire.
Well, you raise a really good point then. I want to return to that in a moment because that is a massive, massive what if. Just to focus on the Western Front for a moment, let's say the US have not entered the First World War in 1917. As a result, are we saying not that the Germans win on the Western Front, but that some kind of negotiated peace that is favourable to the Germans is agreed?
So I think there's a stalemate in the West and a massive victory in the East. But if Germany is controlling Central and Eastern Europe, then it's won the war.
Yeah.
I mean, I think something we hinted at earlier is the strategic sort of view of Germany at this point is dreadful. You know, they're not able to see how they've won so much in the East. And in fact, what the Germans could have done at that point, it said, we've won in the East, let's come to terms ourselves in the West. We might even get to keep Belgium if we do that. And it's this lack of strategic sort of assessment, I think, that I find staggering in Berlin at the time. And I wonder how much it's down to personalities, what the Kaiser views as what he wants out of things, what the government wants. And as Alex has hinted, there's real disagreements between the army and the civilian politicians at this time. But not to be able to see the advantages as we are seeing it now is really staggering.
Well, OK, well, let's say that the Germans have effectively won the First World War, or certainly had a negotiated peace that is very favourable to them. They're dominating Central and Eastern Europe. Under this scenario, I mean, this is the classic what-if of all World War I counterfactuals. What then happens in terms of the Second World War and the rise of the Nazis? Presumably, you haven't had the...
Well, the key point, James, of course, the Americans don't get a vote at any peace treaty.
Yes, absolutely.
And so you don't get the influence of President Wilson. You don't get the League of Nations as proposed. And so you have a totally different laydown with a very powerful Germany recovering, of course. But the fact the Americans don't get a vote means that France and Britain and Italy have to deal with this very strong Germany. And how do you restrain it in future?
Rather than thinking just about maps, we also need to think a bit about ideas, because one of the big impacts of the US entry into the war and the involvement is to try and turn the war into being a war about democracy and about what's known as self-determination, the rights of peoples to determine their own governments, which is hugely corrosive for the empires. It's at first aimed against Austria-Hungary, which is a multi-ethnic empire, Germany's ally. But of course, the ideas that come out of the Russian Revolution and of Wilson in America, that the new world should be based on democracy. It should be based on smaller nations who all talk with each other and obey international law in new international organisations like the League of Nations, the forerunner to today's United Nations. Without US entry, there's none of that. Instead, what you end up with is Europe still dominated by monarchies, and the German monarchy actually revitalised by its victory as, yes, monarchy is not old-fashioned, it's a modern, successful form of government. You end up with the empires shaken financially, but not to the same extent ideologically. And so I think what we would see if the US hadn't entered the war would be power blocks, with the US dominating its own sphere in South America. Britain had been very influential in South America before the First World War, but lost a lot of ground as a result of the economic strain. US and Japanese Pacific tensions, Germany dominating Central and Eastern Europe, and the British and French empires, both impoverished, but still likely surviving much, much longer than they did.
So counterintuitively, effective defeat in the First World War would have been better for the British Empire in the long term?
Well, not defeat. I mean, I think what we're talking about is an armistice based on an armed peace. I mean, Germany's still there and still a threat. We've got to remember that British policy for nearly 200 years was about achieving a balance of power in Europe, but also protecting the empire. Now, that would have continued. I mean, what's quite interesting about the post-war period is even with the Treaty of Versailles and the way it turned out, economic growth in the world actually increased over what it had been in 1914, between 1919 and 1927. And I'm afraid to say we always look back through the lens of the Great Depression in 1929. In fact, economies were growing, even with the way in which the war turned out. So what Alex says is absolutely right. These countries would have re-established not only their forms of government, but also international trade as well. Now, America would have wanted to be part of that, given what we said about its fleet and its connections and things like that. So America, with Wilson as president, but also with its economic and commercial interests, would have wanted to get involved. That's the point. And I think even without a military intervention in World War I, the Americans would have sought, with the ideas that they were pushing at the time, a seat at the table in any peace settlement, because it had a lot of interest in Europe at the time. It had a lot of interest dealing with the empires around the world. I think one important thing to mention is that the German colonies in the Pacific would have survived, of course, if Germany had come to an armed peace. That wouldn't have been taken away from them. And of course, what's happened in 1914 is the Japanese have actually captured all the German possessions in World War I. So what's going to happen there? Are the Japanese going to be dissatisfied because the German colonies have to be returned to Germany, or do they just hang on to them?
Well, let's come on to the Pacific, because if we are saying that what ends up being World War II doesn't happen, and certainly doesn't happen in the way it happens because of this scenario, you presumably still end up with some kind of conflict in the Pacific in the 20th century between the US and the Japanese, do you?
I think potentially yes, I think probably yes, but you might end up with broader conflicts too. I was just thinking about the question you asked me and also what Chris has said. And of course, as well as getting all this land, the other thing that Germany has that stays intact is its fleet. And Britain entered the war above all, firstly for balance of power reasons, and secondly to destroy the German fleet. And in the scenario we're talking about now, neither of those happen, and Germany ends up much more powerful. So it's not out of the question that Germany may have pushed further in future years and attempted to destroy the British Empire. Maybe what we're talking about is not the survival of the British Empire so much, but the survival of empires and imperialism for far, far longer. And that applies as much to Germany as it does to Japan.
I mean, I think you're right, Alex. I mean, with this huge industrial capacity and the ambitions of the German military and the Imperial House, it's almost certain, given how they went after the First World War, as it turned out, that they would seek to build a huge navy at this point. And that is obviously to pursue imperial ambitions around the world and to basically take on the British. Shouldn't forget, the British are still the most powerful empire in the 1920s, despite everything that's happened in the First World War. The fleet is the biggest, there's no question about that. They have to come off the two-power standard, where they had, in the past, they said, look, we have to be at least as powerful as the two next biggest fleets. That's abandoned in 1919. We just can't afford that anymore. But I think you're right, Alex. You know, the Germans, strong on land, all this industrial capacity, they're going to build a big fleet. That was always their ambition, and they would want to go imperial.
It does seem plausible, and there's actually a connection with today as well. You know, when we think about the erosion of international law, of international organisations, and the way that the world seems to be shifting away from alliances and towards great power spheres of influence. That's certainly what the Russians want in the East today.
Chinese.
Possibly, yeah, the Chinese, absolutely. Possibly Trump as well. It seems increasingly likely that a spheres of influence idea is shaping the new American foreign policy. Problem with that is it tends to be very unstable, because those spheres of influence, they butt up against each other.
Yeah.
And one of the things about history is nothing stays still. Things change.
Well, I think we should also ask ourselves the question, what is the long-term impact on the US? Not least in terms of its general approach to intervention. I mean, if you haven't intervened in the First World War, presumably this, you know, ingrained American psyche about isolationism, that continues, and it makes it less likely, does it, that the US will intervene again later on in the 20th century?
It depends on circumstances, doesn't it? It depends on investments. It depends on, you know, the psychology of the people at the time and what they want. I mean, my own view is the Americans turn to the Pacific. Japan is a serious threat to everybody at the end of the First World War. They've got experience. They've shown they're actually quite good. They're pressing on China quite a lot. We mentioned earlier on the 21 demands that they put on China, which eventually would have made China a Japanese colony. There's no question about that. And we saw later in Manchuria how the Japanese wanted to take over China. That is already underway before and during the First World War. They've captured the German colonies, the Carolina Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and the Palau Islands. They're already thinking about fortifying those islands and projecting out into the Pacific. You've got huge American interests in the Philippines and across the Pacific. And America has an open door policy, calls it an open door policy with regard to China. We want an even playing field for trading with China. We want to guarantee its territorial and constitutional integrity. And that's precisely opposite to what Japan wants with regard to China. So it's almost inevitable they're going to butt up against it. At the end of the First World War, the Japanese even proposed to invade Siberia to support the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. They actually put troops on the ground. And they talk about going as far as Lake Baikal. Now, this is a country that is very aggressive and expanding rapidly. And they demand parity in terms of their military power and in terms of racial status with the Americans and the British. And one of the interesting things is at the end of the war, the British and the Americans say, no, you're not. You know, we run this town and you guys need to know your place. And of course, the Japanese really resent that. And we shouldn't also forget that at the end of the First World War, and this would have happened without American intervention, you've still got significant naval and commercial rivalry between the Americans and the British. And with this idea that the Americans don't like empires, the Americans see the British fleet as being absolutely the underpinning of the British Empire. So what's our plan for dealing with the British Navy? And there is a plan.
Yeah, and it does make you wonder as well, Alex, if the Americans hadn't come on side in 1917, does that also alter the long-term relationship between Britain and the US? I mean, what is sometimes slightly cringily called the special relationship now, does that ever get established?
I don't think it does. I didn't really... It's difficult to imagine that special relationship without the shared fighting in the Second World War against Germany and Japan. Whereas what we're talking about now is not one Second World War, but instead a world which has lots of regional wars by great powers. We're not talking teddy bears and biscuits, are we? This is still a dark and violent world full of imperial and international conflict.
It's a global conflict rather than a world war. That's the point. I mean, I think in all of this, what we have to think about in terms of counterfactuals is what does it mean for the 20s and 30s as we know it? This is not a world that Hitler would recognise or even survive in. There's no need for Hitler in this scenario. There's no need, perhaps, for communism or fascism. So if the Americans hadn't intervened, they wouldn't have spent the rest of the century having to deal with fascism and communism.
The entire 20th century looks fundamentally different. Well, just to conclude, Alex, would you say that American intervention in the First World War won the war for the Allies?
No, but I think it stopped them losing.
Yeah, that's right.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to the historical sources, every single German politician and military officer in his memoir says it was the blockade that killed us. We couldn't sustain the forces in the field against the British and French. So it so weakened them that they couldn't sustain it. I think there are massive strategic errors. We pointed it out today. If the Germans could actually... problem is with the Germans is they didn't know they were winning. And they lost.
Yeah, and it's entirely possible that the US would not have intervened. I mean, it came very close not to happening. They'd been staying out of the war for the first 3 years. Had the Zimmermann telegram not been intercepted, had the Germans not decided to, restart unrestricted submarine warfare, it could have easily happened.
I mean, Alex pointed out right at the start, OK, they really contrived to lose this war with the Zimmermann telegram episode and also the unrestricted submarine warfare. Without those two things, the Americans are hovering on the edges. They're supplying finance, they're supplying supplies. They're actually making a lot of money out of it, but they're not going to get involved.
Maybe the best way to sum up is that Germany lost this war against Britain, France, the US and their allies. But what US involvement did was change the rest of the 20th century, both in Eastern Europe and at the Atlantic and Pacific worlds too.
Well, gentlemen, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you to you both. I think we can say, first of all, it was by no means inevitable that the US would intervene in the First World War. Had the Germans not begun unrestricted submarine warfare at the beginning of 1917, had the Zimmermann telegram not been intercepted, then it's perfectly possible that President Wilson would have kept the US out for good. And had that happened, you could end up with a very different outcome to the First World War, with Germany either winning or, more likely, not losing and ending up with a situation where it dominates Central and Eastern Europe. And then the entire 20th century looks very, very different as a result. You almost certainly don't get the Second World War as it indeed played out. You don't get the rise of Nazism, you don't get the rise of fascism across Europe, maybe you don't get the rise of Soviet communism as well, and the Soviet Union does not become the superpower that it becomes in the latter part of the 20th century. And what does it mean for the US as well? Do they still have a conflict in the Pacific with the Japanese at some point during the 20th century? Quite possibly. What does it mean for the concept of monarchy and empire as well during the 20th century? Big fundamental questions, all stemming from the decision by the US to enter the First World War in April 1917. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Professor Alexander Watson and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And of course, thank you to our sponsors. Visit Malta. Remember, if you want to find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. And we'll be back undoing more history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.